The following episode contains trigger warnings for the discussion of sexual abuse, rape, drug use, and addiction. Please proceed with caution. In 1996, New York Magazine writer Daniel Mendelsohn published an article which addressed the cultural visibility and significance of gay and lesbian experiences. Provocatively titled, "When Did Gays Get So Straight?" Mendelsohn states that the cultural imagination, the way gay people distinguished themselves within a socio-cultural context, had shifted from the exoticized gay margin to the normalized straight center. At the heart of this statement is a social conflict which predates Mendelsohn's writings and has persisted into the 2020s, the debate surrounding queer assimilationism and sanitization. Within this debate, norms and practices, places and spaces have been scrutinized for their presumed queerness and, by extension, incompatibility with heteronormative and cisnormative culture. Sometimes, these practices and spaces are benign. Sometimes, they are sites of radical self-expression, fraught with both risk and reward. One such site of contestation is the practice of chemsex. As a controversial topic in LGBTQ+ journalism, today, our question on chemsex is this: what is the significance of this practice in UK queer society? And should we preserve facets of queer culture which risk the welfare of queer people? Welcome to episode 12 of /Queer. You're here with me, your host, Georgie Williams. If you haven't heard of chemsex before, you're not alone. It can be hard to define chemsex. Interestingly enough, the UK-based organisation Drugwise defines chemsex as a term used by gay or bisexual men to describe sex that occurs under the influence of drugs. The fact that this practice is, in this example, defined by the sexual orientation and gender of those involved, speaks to the assumptions made surrounding chemsex culture. First and foremost, one has to question whether heterosexual individuals are supposed to have another word for sex that occurs under the influence of drugs. If such a word exists for, predominantly, gay and bisexual men, what necessitated the creation of such a word? To what extent is it normalized or acceptable in the social circles of men who have sex with men? Chemsex is a controversial topic for obvious reasons. One of the motivating factors behind the decision to produce this episode was a fan of the podcast reaching out to us directly about chemsex, as something that had affected her directly. As a trans woman who had spent time in a rehabilitation centre as a consequence of her own chemsex experiences, her decision to bring this subject to the team was evidence enough that chemsex is a practice which has reached beyond the lifestyles of gay and bisexual men. The drugs most commonly associated with chemsex in the UK are GHB, often referred to as G, crystal methamphetamine, cocaine, and ketamine. At the centre of the drug abuse narrative present in the British mainstream media is a purported concern about the impact of illegal drug use on the country's National Health Service, or NHS. As years of socio-economic inequality and austerity under a Conservative Party government have pushed this essential service to its limit, many more right-leaning publications have propagated notions of more vulnerable groups abusing this healthcare system, from immigrants and refugees to drug users and addicts. This is one of the factors which reinforces the shaming of drug users in the UK, with a presumption that those who use said drugs make decisions which not only endanger themselves, but the medical resources available to others across the country. But to what extent is drug use a central component of chemsex culture? What are the risks involved? And what does queerness symbolise within the chemsex debate?
So this is the interesting thing about if you describe chemsex, say, as a social phenomenon, or even the pathology narrative that would describe it as an addiction. I think it's kind of poly-addictive in an interesting way.
The voice you're listening to is that of Dr. Sebastian Baxter. Dr. Sebastian Baxter is a Manchester-based queer artist and activist. He holds a PhD in art and design, having conducted practice-led artistic research into place, space and identity in post-Celtic Tiger Island. Dr. Baxter is active in the fields of visual anthropology, sexual health and artistic research, and has a background in film, performance art, poetry, and prose. His work has been presented at a variety of academic conferences, independent cinemas, squats, social centres, and radical fringe gallery spaces. Dr. Sebastian describes himself as suspicious of the official art world. He currently heads up the transgressive queer artistic research space Manchester Penetrated, a project that employs video, photography, poetry, performance, storytelling, and sex maps, amongst other things, to challenge dominant narratives around chemsex, cruising, addiction, mental health, and marginal identity.
So people obviously focus on the chems and the sex aspect of chemsex, of the practice. And obviously they're kind of like central to it, you know what I mean? Like it's, you know, it's not going to have one without the other. But there's a whole other set of experiences, I think, that go on at a chill out or between two people that are engaging in chemsex. You know, I would point to the centrality of bareback gay porn. It's, you know, as the background atmosphere to the action, you know, it's there to kind of, you know, create sort of living out sexual fantasy. So we see these like amazing guys doing, you know, really agile forms of sexual, you know, sexual acrobatics. And because of the drugs that you have kind of the ability then to kind of perform the same type of sex. Jamie Hakim, I'm sure you read Jamie Hakim's work. I was very influenced by when he talked about intimate collectivity. The notion that a lot of what happens at a chemsex chill out is not actually sex or drug use. It is those also, but it is that sort of kind of men sitting around naked together talking about things. And sometimes those things can be like quite trivial. So a lot of the time it's like, which guy's on Grindr going, oh, what you thinking? Oh, yeah, oh, mine's him. Or talking about this guy's cock and, oh, I threesome this person, you know, and a lot of it's about that. But it's also storytelling as well. It's about engaging sort of, it does those narratives of a certain way of life. But it can, depending on the participants, it can go to sort of really profound areas. I've noticed a lot of the time, like, people will talk kind of quite freely and quite openly about, you know, sexual abuse that they've endured or suffered in their life, in a very sort of, I'm not traumatized way of speaking about it. So it's that sort of thing that where you, if you go into counsel and your experience is all trauma, you know, but this is an ability. Crystal is a perfect drug for this as well, because it allows you to kind of look at your experience of life in a sort of detached way. Do you know what I mean? So you can see it, but it's not damaging you by seeing it at that point. And people are sort of sharing that as well. I think there's a very interesting thing for me, and I think I kind of made it up into a theory one night. Talking to some guys chill out, as if it is actually a theory and true. I like sometimes inventing things just to see how they fly. But basically, I think there is a correlation between the development of like Chemsex, Grindr, and Uber. So it's that for me, flying through the night kind of thing on the way to a new place and who will be there and what it'll be like. There's a sort of sense of adventure and daring do to it. You know, I think, like, I mean, I don't know if there's any research around this, but like, you know, the development of Chemsex, Uber and Grindr in sort of parallel. Because if you think about it, like, how is it, like, who's an Uber driver going to make money off at 3 o'clock on a Tuesday night in a given city? Like, who's out and about then? It'll generally be some horny gay guys, you know, heading across the city to the next space. I think there's a culture, like, I see chemsex as a subculture because it has its own kind of language, it has its own codes and systems and, you know, symbols and icons. And so, you know, even like the way we use language, you know, we don't say needles, we say pins, you know, they're not drugs, they're chems, you know, it's like, are you high and horny, you know, there's a whole kind of like raft of like terms and phrases that are indicators, you know, that they're your use of them says that, oh yeah, I'm one of you too. So there is that collective experience in that sense, a sense of you're part of something in a way, but not in the sense of when we talk about other kind of subcultural movements, such as like punk or, you know, even like sort of queer art movements that exist like in London or Manchester, where there's a more conscious, I think, realization of being part of something. With chemsex, it's much looser than that. There's not like a There's not a sense of shared adventure so much. But I certainly think like COVID has really, really kind of exposed that in a way that, you know, the sudden loss of that ability to kind of be part of this very loose tribe, and it's very, very, very loose. There are all types of groups of people who are all time, you know, engaging in chemsex that, you know, I don't participate in. Like, for instance, what I call the A gays, A gay chill outs. Like, it's all the kind of like, you know, both sort of, you know, this usually white, you know, this desired gays or whatnot. And I used like when I started engaging in chemsex first, like just under a decade ago, I went to a few of them, but then I found like they're the spaces where a lot of the sort of, you know, socially undesirable kind of aspects of chemsex, so that, you know, the people like overdosing and going under in G a lot, and, you know, the non-consensual sex and all that kind of stuff seems to happen in those spaces. Also, I'm really kind of naughty and arsey, so like I do hold people to challenge people and hold people to account. So you're just like, yeah, I guess you get out. I also, because of my job quite early, I kind of a few years back sort of like, okay, I'm a bit exposed here, so I tend to kind of use my own space or go to chill outs with guys I know and trust. It's an attempt to sort of create a safer space in which to engage with what at the end of the day are quite powerful drugs and can be quite dangerous drugs. For instance, I administer G to people because, and if they say, if I don't know them that well, and they go like, oh, I say, well, what's your hit? And if they go, oh, I take it generally about like a mil, that's like, I'll give you 0.7. Until I know that you can do a mil, like that's what you're getting, you know. So there is a sense, I suppose, in a very, very loose sense of community. And I think there's so many ways in which technology sort of play a role in this, you know. Grindr obviously has been the main route to kind of connecting with chemsex, but how like WhatsApp groups kind of appear, you know, that are like bareback groups. They're not essentially chemsex groups, but they are really. It's interesting that like cam stuff is starting to kind of come in or become a part of the culture. Obviously, it's a response to conditions of social distancing and COVID-19. There's a lot of people, guys are now like performing for each other online, and I think that kind of replaces some. I think there's an aspect to chemsex that is the whole like exhibitionist hit that you get off it. There's something really, really, really joyful as well about like being in a room with a bunch of other men naked. That something really liberating about that. I did a performance piece before, and I was talking about how I went to chill out, and it was with 4 guys. There's guys I knew and used to chill out quite a lot together, and one of them was going to the shop to pick up something. I was like, oh, what do you want? And jokingly, somebody said, oh, lollipops. But he came back with 4 lollipops first. So we were all sitting around like watching bareback gay porn, you know, looking at lollipops. I was just like, it's like really childlike and innocent in some ways. So I think there's those aspects. There's a kind of like poly addiction, because not all guys who do chemsex are addicted, but like sort of polysensory attraction. That's very, very hard to replace. And I'm conscious as well like that we really don't know what's happened on the ground fully in the last 4 months. My instinct is that chemsex has reduced massively. And I know London Friend did a survey very early on. It was like, yeah, it seemed like practice was kind of like really, really kind of course, like some people's reaction to that is, oh, yeah, but we can't be sure of the findings of that survey because loads of gay guys were probably lying about that. And it's like, well, why would you go on a survey, you know, take the time to actively go on a survey to distort its findings? Do you know what I mean? It doesn't make any sense. Like, it's yet again, like a certain type of queer man must be lying and must be untrustworthy because they engage in this sort of stuff. So they're probably a bit, you know, yeah, there's a lot of kind of mechanisms by which normative or homonormative culture attempts to sort of pathologize you and stigmatize you without even going into this sort of slamming and people going under aspect of things.
The subcultural aspect of chemsex is, at least linguistically, highly interesting. The field of LGBTQ+ linguistics, formerly referred to as lavender lexicons, explore the development of language within queer circles. Language once necessitated by the taboo and stigmatized nature of being queer. A speech community is a community that shares linguistic traits and tends to have community boundaries that coincide with social units. Speakers of a particular lexicon may resist culturally dominant language and oppose cultural authority by maintaining their own varieties of speech. Being able to communicate your identity and create a sense of commonality, solidarity, and shared understanding through language has been an imperative within queer circles throughout various periods of history across a multitude of geographies. But with assimilation being enabled through a decrease in stigmatization of queer identities in some cultures and communities, this need for exclusive language is being lost. No doubt, in many ways, this is a valuable payoff. With integration and assimilation comes various protections and privileges previously denied to queer peoples. However, there is still much to grieve in seeing languages and practices made obsolete. Chemsex, for all the taboo and stigma that endures surrounding this practice, appears an unlikely site of conservation. The language used here still acts as a screening process, allowing the inducted to engage and preventing access to outsiders.
How do location and social class come into play with chemsex? So is this practice more common or popular in particular communities? And if so, what do you believe causes this?
Okay, so I suppose we'll deal with location first. Yeah, chemsex is different in different spaces. What I've noticed over the years in Manchester is that chemsex has become much kind of more fragmented, and it's much smaller groups of guys. More of it, but in smaller groups. At the start, when I started going to chill outs in Manchester, it was all like big 10, 20 guys there. And that was the norm then. But it seems here, at least, that it's kind of, then they still happen, and that, like a lot of the gay sort of stuff are kind of, that still happens. But a lot of what you find is that it's much smaller groups of people, little networks of people. And then new people are brought into that. The types of drugs people use is affected by location. So, for instance, ketamine is more popular at chill outs here in Manchester than it is in London. Here, particularly with the gay end of things, crystal meth is a little bit frowned upon. So, MCAT and G are like the ones, the go-tos there. But kind of, oh no, I wouldn't use crystal because that's all really, that's really fucked up, whereas in London that crystal is was always totally part and parcel. It's a given that you use crystal, whether you slam or smoke or whatever. And when you go into the sort of smaller cities then as well, there's differences as well. And I've noticed in smaller cities that coke and MDMA are pretty common. Also, in Manchester, I've never gone to a chill out where there's been a cis woman there. I've gone to chill outs where there's trans woman, pre-op trans woman, and there's a lot of fetishization going on there. I think there hasn't been an awful lot of work done on the experience of pre-op trans women at chill outs, because it's sometimes very transactional and fetishized. But you go say Warrington, and I haven't been to one of these chats, but I've heard of where there's cis women. Quite often sex workers at chill outs. It does shift in location. In terms of social class, this is, I think, one of the things about chemsex that's for me most alluring and most interesting is that there isn't a social class that's more prevalent. It is very, 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 very diverse in that sense. Ethnically, in terms of economic background, it's at age. There's a really wide spread of people who engage, which for me is really that's a really kind of important aspect of the culture, because if you go to a club in the city centre, it is going to be dominated by cis white gay men, and that's not the case with chemsex. I don't think I'd be interested in it if it was just a bunch of white guys, cis middle-class white guys. It bored out my mind. I want that kind of, I want to find out about other people and their experiences. So I don't think in terms of ethnicity, social class, of age, even body type, it's very, 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 very spread. Now I have noticed distinct similarities in a way between the type of people who engage in chemsex to a sort of extensive degree. And I mentioned that piece Chill that I wrote, and just when we were talking earlier, this sort of prevalence of guys who've suffered sexual abuse or rape at some stage in their life. That seems to be a constant. Or also, there's a lot of people I feel who engage, and this is not to sort of back up, Matthew Todd and Dave Stewart, sort of the homophobia, internal homophobia narrative, because I don't believe that, and I don't think that's correct. But a lot of guys who have, in one way or another, at some stage in life, struggled with their sexual identity or their gender identity, and never really resolved it, I suppose, to a satisfactory degree. And there's a lot of guys who do chemsex that are on the down low, and this is their queerness, or this is how they get to participate. This is how they get to engage in their sex, and they may be married to, cis woman and whatnot. Like it's that's also it's sort of how to get to know people. Almost everybody's using a false name and or telling you that what they do is not what they do, particularly because quite a few people from the who work in the NHS engage in chemsex as well, and there is huge consequences then for speaking a bit too freely about that, because of how the dominant narrative of chemsex, how it's been articulated, has been so pathologizing, so stigmatizing, that the associations with it are quite dark. So I'm probably one of the few people working in these fields that is like open about my use, and my work is about my use and whatnot. But I still got that thing where, like, I talk to somebody about, chemsex, and they're like, I immediately think, oh, you must be like raping guys at the weekend and going under and G all the time. And it's like, there are people who want to engage in this in a way that's like safe and enjoyable for everyone, and there are people who look out for each other as well. And yeah, I think that's where things become tricky, because and the notion that if you're doing chemsex you have a problem. There's lots of people who don't have a problem, but if things start to get difficult for them, they're unlikely to approach organizations for help if that's how they feel they're going to be portrayed. And the imbalance as well is like because the organization I work for has a chemsex support program. And I think it's a slow realization among practitioners that, how it's been represented is slightly skewed, because if you're working for an organization that does chemsex support, you're likely to be hearing the very, very worst of things. You're like somebody who's at pretty much the end of their tether with this. You're not going to hear all the sort of sweet and funny stories about, like, guys eating lollipops naked together. Do you know what I mean? Like, that's probably not going to come up. It's mostly they'll say, oh, I got really fucked up and did this fucked up thing. And, so yeah, like that's when you look at something solely through one lens and fix it that way, you're kind of excluding a lot of other experiences. And then people don't feel represented in how this is how this is articulated. And then that kind of scares them off in a way. So it's interesting that it is a subculture, but it's a subculture in which nobody wants to identify as being part of that subculture. Almost nobody. It's very underground in that sense. But I think one of the most important things about chemsex as a culture, a subculture, is its diversity. And I think it's a response as well to sort of how homogenized queer spaces have become, and just how fucking boring they've become.
The homogeneity of queer spaces is a hot topic. In London's Nocturnal Queer Geographies, Campkin and Marshall address how, in the country's capital, A great number of LGBTQ+ venues are both owned by and seem to be largely catering to cisgender, white, able-bodied, middle-class men. These venues do present a homogeneous sample of the queer community, a sample which is in many ways more palatable to a non-queer audience. When we consider the concept of the good gay versus the bad queer, we should think about how the values of a society, and by extension, a state, are reproduced through one's body. Is your appearance considered the whitewashed norm, or is your existence politicized and thus considered radical and disruptive if you are a person of colour? Are you able-bodied and thus considered normal, or do you have a visible disability or additional needs? Do your desires and aspirations conform to capitalism? The difference between the good gay and the bad queer is often how much an individual is willing to atone for their gender or sexuality by performing and practicing that which is valued in a cisgender and heterosexual society. The good gay is excused for being gay, since it's deemed the only rebellious outlier in their personality. Ultimately, cisgender, white, able-bodied, middle-class gay men are often considered less of a threat to the conservation of traditional social values than other queer individuals. But they cannot, and should not, be considered a fair representation of the queer community.
I feel like in many ways you've already answered my third question, but are there any other misconceptions surrounding chemsex that you feel need to be dispelled?
All of them. Yeah, I suppose perceptions. One thing on location actually that's interesting that just came to me as well is that when I started doing chems and doing chill outs years ago, like all the chill outs were in the city centre of Manchester, and that's changed over the years. So Salford's now like one of the principal chemsex sort of chill out locations, and Trafford and some of the other boroughs is starting to spread out. And you'd wonder, is there a link then between property speculation and property prices going up in city centres, and gay guys not having the space or the money to afford space, and therefore sort of breeding out to other parts of the country as well. In terms of misconceptions, I think like the main sort of medical understanding of it, I think is obviously where I want to attack. I have somewhat of a problem with the sort of liberationist model as well. I think there's a sense where somebody is trying to represent chemsex as this sort of non-conformist, sort of anti-statist, anti consciously a political thing. Now, I've never been witness to a conscious political articulation of sort of like manifestly against the homogenization and of LGBT or queer space. I don't identify as LGBT queer, I think there is a politics to it, but it's politics very, very small p, and it isn't a kind of a sort of resistance movement against heteronormativity. Those things can be expressed by people engaged in chemsex, but I think almost as well the liberationist model sort of isn't comfortable with then talking about some of the things that the medical model, like the stigmatizing pathology end of things, sort of reinforces. Like, I mean, I did a performance at an ACT UP event in London, and parts of performance it was like naked in a paddling pool with a co-performer, and like sex toys and drug paraphernalia and condoms live everywhere. But I was basically talking about like HIV and addiction, and it was that thing that like look, I'm not saying like I have had like every STI under the sun. I've been raped at a chill out. I've had psychosis and it's shit. I am clearly an addict. However, I still enjoy this. Like, I'm not an idiot. I wouldn't do it if it was all bad. There are problems, of course, but what we in our culture we've got a very infantile way of looking at substances and misuse and addiction. Like, it's like Yeah, there's a sort of hierarchy of drugs. So you can go into work, for example, and say, "Oh, I was out in piss last night. I'm really hungover." And we go, "Oh yeah, oh yeah." And like you and go, "Oh, I was slamming all last night. I whacked us up a clunk, got a bit of sleep, so I'm fine." Like, you know. And then like you'd like to get a disciplinary for that. I said, "Well, why? What's the difference between the two?" Actually, a hangover, I feel fucking off. I could be chem for 6 days and I'll get a bit of sleep. I'm fine, you know. A bit tired, obviously. I think that there's a problem there with a society that looks at the addict and basically sort of, you know, it turns them into a pathological being that sort of is in need of our care and help, you know, and has no agency, despite like kind of harm reduction practices becoming kind of more prevalent. There is still sort of abstinence. The notion that like if you're not desiring abstinence at some stage, there's something wrong. But if you like, you know, you do the abstinence thing, like, you know, you go through the fucking pain of it, you know, the sort of the thing that's keeping you alive and keeping you sane being taken out of your life, the sort of, you know, lack of self-belief, you know, the relapse repeat, and what do you get back in return? An entire like society is built around, you know, alcohol, and you know, you can't get a coffee after like 6 o'clock in the evening. You know, it's all about sex and drugs and alcohol, and you know, it's so what does the addict get back in return for their attempts to be abstinent? I'm like, why should they be abstinent? If so, I'm an addict. I fully accept that and embrace it almost as an identity. But like, I'm not out robbing off your granny. Like, you know, I'm paying for my own chems, and you know, whatever happens to my body if I hit psychosis, whatever, that's for me to deal with. I'm not like, you know, it's burden on the state. You know, it's like, it's what business of yours if I'm an addict? Like, what's wrong with that? Like, I don't see anything to be ashamed of at all. So I think there's something for me in my work. There's something about the power of claiming something, of saying, you know, directly something. Yeah, I do this. What? Well, what do you want to say? Oh, but all these bad things that happen. Yeah, sure, that happened to me. You know, you haven't asked me about like the reasons why I would still do it that are joyous and, you know, immersive and engaging. So with my work, I'm kind of using kind of storytelling as a means of doing that, and like not attempting to kind of shirk off the issues, like address them, but address them to like use chemsex. I suppose it was interesting at a point, you know, I thought, what's the purpose of finding subjects to talk about something when I do the thing I want to talk about? So use my own body as a vessel to talk about the whole myriad of really, really interesting things that chemsex kind of shines a light on. And I think addiction is something that we need to start talking about in a different way. And I think chemsex is an interesting vehicle in which to do so, because of the sort of polyaddictive, polysensory things that are going on. I think there's something there. So I'm kind of, you know, playing around with how I kind of then approach that sort of as a topic. But yeah, I don't know if that's fully answered what.
I mean, yeah, no, I think it has. Thank you so much.
Dr. Baxter's perspective on this culture is inextricable from his standpoint, personal investments and experiences. I was grateful for his insight and how he demonstrated the complexity of this subject through both his experiences as a man who has sex with other men and as an addict. If anything is evident from Sebastian's testimonial, it is that chemsex practices will persist regardless of attitudes towards drugs and queer culture. I don't want to use this platform to endorse chemsex, I want to make that clear. But throughout the history of policy development for sex education and drug education, one thing has been clear: that abstinence-focused education is ineffective. We cannot prevent people from making decisions which could potentially adversely impact their mental or physical health, but we can provide resources and services for those who do, or are trying to avoid doing so. It is both patronizing and infantilizing to treat queer individuals and others who engage in chemsex as if their behavior needs to be regulated by others for their own good. Drug addiction is a serious issue and debilitating for many people. but that doesn't warrant demonization or the stripping of one's agency. It requires education, open dialogues, signposting to relevant services, and a transformative approach to how we address the subjects of drug use and sexuality. It is far more difficult to unlearn practices and habits when we fear judgment for having fostered them in the first place. In conjuring an example of queer culture, few of us will think first of chemsex. But this community exists, and is perhaps not as two-dimensional as one might perceive it to be from the outside. Academically, particularly anthropologically, the practice is fascinating. But a pragmatic and impersonal approach to this subject overlooks the very human complexities present. The dangerous, the erotic, the joyful and the painful components interwoven throughout stories about chemsex. Chemsex is and will likely remain an integral part of queer culture in the United Kingdom and beyond. And I believe what will come to define our culture's approach to this practice is our willingness to educate one another and support one another, regardless of our personal choices. This episode of the Slash Queer podcast was edited by Sam Clay, transcribed by Bronya Smith, and scripted and produced by me, Georgie Williams. A very special thanks to Dr. Sebastian Baxter for his contributions to this episode. If you are interested in learning more about the subject of chemsex, you can find a list of relevant UK organisations on the LGBTQ+ resources section of the Slash Queer website. Thanks once again to my Patreon subscribers who ensure that this stone-cold broke queer can afford a coffee between interviews for this podcast. If you're not a Patreon and you want to help this podcast continue to grow, you can find the Slash Queer Patreon at patreon.com//queer. That's SLASH queer. The link is also available on our Facebook, Instagram and Twitter pages. This podcast is growing in reach and popularity with every episode, so even if you can't contribute financially, giving us a share or just subscribing makes a world of difference. We still have merch available and are taking donations via Ko-fi. You can find the links to both in the description for this episode. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank all of you who responded to our call for volunteers across our social media platforms. So a warm welcome is in order for June, Lindsay and Bronya, who are donating their time as translators and transcribers. This episode was recorded on location in London in the United Kingdom. Music in this episode was composed by Kevin MacLeod. If you enjoyed this episode or have any feedback, please get in touch on Instagram or Twitter at @/queer, or email us at /queer@outlook.com. As is our mantra, stay kind, stay radical, and stay queer.